In 62 AD, in the city of Jerusalem, a man was dragged to the top of the temple. He was in his 60s. He spent so many hours praying on his knees that people said his skin had turned to leather. They called him Old Camel Knees. He was one of the most respected men in the entire city. Jews and Christians alike came to him for judgment. He settled disputes. He led the largest church in the ancient world. His name was James, and he was the brother of Jesus Christ. The religious authorities threw him off the temple pinnacle, and when the fall didn't kill him, they stoned him, and when the stones didn't finish the job, someone crushed his skull with a wooden club used for cleaning cloth. Now here's what almost nobody talks about. James wasn't alone. Jesus had an entire family, 4 brothers, at least 2 sisters. And after the crucifixion, these relatives didn't just fade into the background. They built the early church. They led congregations across the ancient world. They kept meticulous genealogical records tracing their bloodline all the way back to King David. And then, sometime in the 4th century, they vanished from history. So what happened to them? Where did the physical bloodline of Jesus' family go? And why does almost nobody in the church talk about this? To understand this story, we need to start with a word. A single Greek word that has caused more theological arguments than almost any other term in the New Testament. The word is adelphos. Open your Bible to Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. The people of Nazareth are watching Jesus teach, and they're confused. They say, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother called Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And aren't all his sisters with us?" 4 brothers, named, listed, right there in the text. The word Matthew uses is adelphoi, the plural of adelphos. And here's where it gets interesting. The root of adelphos is delphos, which literally means womb. So, adelphos, at its most literal level, means from the same womb. A sibling, a blood brother. Now, some traditions teach that these weren't biological brothers, that adelphos could mean cousin or stepbrother or relative in a general sense. And that's a real debate with centuries of scholarship behind it. The Greek language does have a specific word for cousin. It's anepsios. Paul uses it in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, when he calls Mark the cousin of Barnabas. He chose a different word on purpose. But when the Gospels talk about the brothers of Jesus, they don't use anepsios, they use adelphos. Every single time. Does that settle it? Not entirely, because in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that Jews in the 1st century actually read, adelphos sometimes gets used for relatives who aren't siblings. The Hebrew word underneath is ach, which can mean brother, half-brother, kinsman, even ally. So the text is genuinely ambiguous. And that ambiguity matters, because depending on how you read that one word, the entire story of Jesus' family changes. But here's what isn't ambiguous. Whatever the exact biological relationship was, the New Testament makes it absolutely clear that these men were considered part of Jesus' immediate family. They grew up in the same household. They traveled with Mary. And after the resurrection, they became some of the most important leaders in the entire Christian movement. Start with James. This is the man Paul calls a pillar of the church in his letter to the Galatians. When Paul goes to Jerusalem, he doesn't report to Peter first. He reports to James. When the early church holds its first major council to decide whether non-Jewish converts need to follow the Torah, it's James who stands up and delivers the final ruling. Not Peter, not John. James, the brother of the Lord. And think about how strange that is for a second. The early church chose Jesus' own brother as the leader of the most important congregation in the world. The Jerusalem church, the mother church, the church that sat on the very ground where Jesus walked and taught and died. This wasn't a ceremonial title. James ran things. He made decisions that shaped the entire trajectory of early Christianity. And he did it for roughly 30 years, from the resurrection until his assassination around 62 AD. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was not a Christian and had no reason to exaggerate, records the death of James. He calls him the brother of Jesus, the one called Christ. And he says the execution was so controversial that it actually led to the removal of the high priest who ordered it. Think about that. The killing of Jesus' brother caused a political crisis in Jerusalem. But James's death didn't end the family's leadership, and this is where the story takes a turn that most people have never heard. After James was killed, the early Christians in Jerusalem didn't elect just anyone to lead them. They chose another family member, a man named Simeon, the son of Clopas. And according to the historian Eusebius, who is our main source for early church history, Clopas was the brother of Joseph, which means Simeon was a cousin of Jesus. The early church kept the leadership inside the family. Simeon led the Jerusalem church for over 40 years. He guided his congregation through one of the most devastating events in Jewish history, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. According to tradition, Simeon received a prophetic warning before the Roman siege and led the entire Christian community out of Jerusalem to a town called Pella across the Jordan River. They survived because they left before the walls fell, and Simeon eventually died a martyr too. Around 107 AD, during the reign of Emperor Trajan, he was arrested. The ancient sources tell us the specific charges. He was accused of two things: being a descendant of David and being a Christian, not teaching heresy, not inciting rebellion. His crime was his bloodline. His crime was who his family was. According to the historian Hegesippus, Simeon was crucified. He was approximately 120 years old. Whether that age is exact or an ancient approximation, the point stands. This man spent his entire life carrying the legacy of his family, and the Roman Empire killed him for it. Now let's talk about a word you've probably never heard before, but one that completely changes how you understand early Christianity. The word is desposini. It comes from the Greek desposunos, meaning of or belonging to the master or of the Lord. And in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the church, this word was reserved exclusively for one group of people, the blood relatives of Jesus Christ. Not just James and Simeon, all of them. Every cousin, nephew, and descendant of Jesus' earthly family who could trace their line back through the household of Joseph and Mary. They had a name, they had an identity, and they had authority. According to the 2nd century historian Hegesippus, whose writings survive only in fragments quoted by Eusebius, every early Jewish Christian community was governed by a desposinos, a blood relative. Each one of them carried traditional family names: Zachary, Joseph, John, James, Joses, Simeon, Matthias. Names that had been passed down through the generations. And here's a detail that stops you cold. None of them were ever named Jesus. The family never reused that name. Think about what that tells you about how they viewed him. This wasn't just a famous relative. This was someone set apart, someone whose name belonged to him alone. But the Roman Empire was watching. Around 81 AD, Emperor Domitian became obsessed with the idea that descendants of King David might try to claim political power. The Messiah, after all, was supposed to come from David's line, and Domitian knew that the family of Jesus traced their ancestry directly back to David. So he sent soldiers to find them. Eusebius quotes Hegesippus describing what happened next. The Roman authorities tracked down the grandsons of Jude, who was called the brother of Jesus according to the flesh. These men were dragged before the emperor himself. Domitian questioned them. "Are you descendants of David?" "Yes," they said. They didn't deny it. "How much property do you own? How much money do you have?" And this is where the story becomes something you couldn't make up. The grandsons of Jude held up their hands. Their palms were covered in thick calluses, cracked and hardened from years of manual labor. They told the emperor they owned a single piece of farmland worth about 9,000 denarii between them. They worked it themselves. They were dirt farmers, literally. And then Domitian asked the question that really mattered. What about this kingdom you people talk about? The kingdom of God? The grandsons of Jude told the Roman emperor the same thing Jesus told Pontius Pilate. Our kingdom is not of this world. It's not a political movement. It's not a military threat. It's spiritual. It comes at the end of the age. Domitian looked at these calloused farmers who owned almost nothing and claimed a spiritual kingdom that existed somewhere beyond the reach of Roman swords. And he dismissed them. He let them go. And here's the part Eusebius adds that makes this story even more remarkable. After being released, these grandsons of Jude became leaders of churches. They were respected as both martyrs because they had been willing to die and as blood relatives of Jesus. Their lives continued into the reign of Emperor Trajan, which began in 98 AD. So these grandchildren of Jesus' brother were still alive and leading Christian communities at the turn of the 2nd century. Stop and picture that scene with Domitian one more time, because there's something happening in that throne room that the ancient writers almost certainly noticed, even if they didn't spell it out. 2 generations earlier, another member of this family had stood before a Roman authority, Jesus of Nazareth, standing before Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. Pilate asked him about a kingdom. Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world. Pilate looked at this unarmed Jewish carpenter and couldn't find a reason to condemn him. Now his nephews are standing in a throne room in Rome, answering the same questions. Are you from the line of David? What about this kingdom? And they give the same answers. Word for word, the family message hadn't changed. 2 generations of Roman interrogation, and the family never flinched, never adjusted the story, never played politics. Their kingdom wasn't a negotiation, it was a conviction. And there's another detail from Hegesippus that deserves attention. He tells us the Desposini kept detailed genealogical records. They maintained family scrolls tracing the line of David through Joseph's household across generations. This was deliberate. This wasn't nostalgia or family pride. In ancient Jewish culture, genealogies were legal documents. They proved your tribal membership, your inheritance rights, your eligibility for the priesthood or the throne. The Desposini preserved these records because they believed the Davidic covenant was still active. God's promise to David hadn't expired, and their family was the living proof. Some traditions say the Emperor Herod, generations before Domitian, actually ordered the burning of Jewish genealogical records stored in the temple archives. If that's true, the Desposini were among the few families who maintained private copies. They were safeguarding something they considered sacred. And every time a Roman emperor came hunting for descendants of David, those records became both a treasure and a target. But what happened after the 2nd century? The historical trail gets thin, and that thinness is itself part of the story. Between the 2nd century and the early 4th century, the Desposini continued to exist. We know this because of what happened in 318 AD. And this event is one of the most important moments in Christian history that almost nobody knows about. In 318 AD, a delegation of Jewish Christian leaders traveled to Rome. They came to meet with Pope Sylvester I. This was just 6 years after the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan. The church was being transformed from a persecuted sect into an imperial institution. Power was shifting, everything was changing, and the Desposini showed up to make their case. According to the account preserved by later historians, the blood relatives of Jesus made 3 demands. First, they wanted Sylvester to revoke his appointment of Greek Christian bishops in Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria. They wanted those seats given to Desposini bishops instead, blood relatives of Jesus leading the churches in the cities where Christianity was born. Second, they demanded that the ancient practice of sending financial contributions to Jerusalem as the mother church be restored. The money that once flowed to the original congregation, the church that James had built, had been redirected to Rome. Third, and this is significant, they asked for the reintroduction of certain practices from the law. The Sabbath, the biblical feast days, the system of holy days that Jesus himself had observed as a practicing Jew. Pope Sylvester listened, and then he rejected everything. He told them that the mother church was now in Rome. He insisted they accept the Greek bishops. He denied their claim to hereditary spiritual authority. And that, as far as the historical record shows, was the last known dialogue between the institutional church and the blood family of Jesus Christ. Pause on that for a second. For 300 years, the relatives of Jesus had led churches, kept genealogies, endured persecution, survived interrogations by Roman emperors, and maintained an unbroken chain of family leadership in the Christian movement. Then, in a single meeting in Rome, they were told that none of it mattered anymore. The bloodline was irrelevant. The institution had spoken. Now, what does this mean? Not just as history, but as something deeper. There's a Hebrew word that helps here, mishpacha. It means family in the fullest sense, not just your parents and siblings, your clan, your lineage, your people stretching back through generations. In ancient Israel, your mishpacha determined your identity, your tribal inheritance, your access to the priesthood, your claim to the land God promised to your ancestors. David's mishpacha was everything. God made a covenant with David that his throne would last forever. The Messiah was expected to come from David's line. And when Matthew opens his gospel, the very first thing he does is lay out a genealogy connecting Jesus to David. Because the bloodline mattered, it was proof of promise fulfilled. The Desposini understood this. They weren't claiming power for ego. They were claiming something they believed God had established through covenant. The family of the Messiah carrying forward the Messiah's mission. And then the institution said no. Consider what that moment must have felt like. These were people who had grown up hearing stories passed down through their family for 3 centuries. Stories about James, who prayed until his knees turned to stone. Stories about Jude's grandson standing before an emperor with dirt under their fingernails. Stories about Simeon guiding an entire congregation to safety before Jerusalem burned. These weren't legends to them. These were family memories. The way your grandfather's war stories aren't mythology. They're personal. And they traveled to Rome, probably weeks of difficult travel across the ancient world, because they believed the church would honor what their family had sacrificed. 3 centuries of service, 3 centuries of martyrdom, 3 centuries of keeping the faith alive in the very land where Jesus walked. They expected recognition. What they got was erasure. None of the 32 popes before Sylvester, and none of the ones who came after him, ever publicly acknowledged that there were at least 3 well-documented lines of legitimate descent from Jesus' own family. The official narrative moved on. Rome was the center now. The bloodline was a footnote. There's a tension in this story that runs right through the heart of Christianity, because on one hand, the New Testament teaches that spiritual inheritance matters more than physical bloodline. Paul writes to the Galatians that in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free. The gospel opens the family of God to everyone. You don't need to be born into the right family. You're adopted in through faith. But on the other hand, God clearly worked through physical families throughout the entire Bible. Abraham's family, David's family, Jesus' family. The bloodline wasn't incidental. It was part of the plan. God chose specific people, specific lineages, specific households to carry his purposes forward in history. So what happens when the spiritual mission gets separated from the physical family that carried it? That's the question the Desposini story forces you to ask. And honestly, that question isn't just about the 4th century. It's about you. Think about it. Every one of us carries something from our family. Maybe it's a faith tradition that goes back generations. Maybe it's a set of values your grandmother lived by. Maybe it's a calling you feel in your bones but can't quite explain. Something that feels bigger and older than your own life. And at some point, the world, or an institution, or just the passage of time, tries to tell you that none of that matters. That the old ways are finished. That the new structure doesn't have room for what your family carried. The Desposini walked into a room in Rome and said, "We are the family of Jesus, and we have been leading his church since the beginning." And the institution said, "That was then, this is now, we're in charge." What do you do when the thing your family was built to carry gets taken away? When the lineage gets dismissed? When someone tells you the bloodline doesn't count? You have to decide what you believe about inheritance. Is it something that can be revoked by a committee? Or is it something woven into your identity so deeply that no institution can touch it? The Desposini disappeared from official history after 318 AD. Their names stopped appearing in church records. Their genealogies, those careful lists tracing the line of David through the family of Jesus, were no longer maintained by anyone in power. But here's what we know about bloodlines. They don't actually disappear. People marry, they have children, they move to new cities, new countries. The DNA keeps going. The family keeps existing even when the records stop. Somewhere in the ancient world, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Jesus' brothers kept living their lives. They farmed land, they worshipped, they told their children stories about who their family was. Maybe they stopped talking about it publicly, because being a descendant of David under Rome was a death sentence. Maybe the knowledge faded over generations, the way family stories always do when no one writes them down, but the blood was still there. The heritage was still real. The covenant God made with David, a throne that would last forever, didn't depend on a pope's approval or an emperor's permission. And that might be the most important thing this story teaches us. Your identity doesn't require institutional validation. What God puts in your bloodline, in your calling, in your family's story, isn't something that can be voted away in a meeting. The desposini were silenced. They were dismissed. They were written out of the official narrative. But they were still the family of Jesus. And whatever you're carrying, whatever calling or inheritance or identity that feels like it's being overlooked or dismissed or erased, the Desposini story says something to you. The institution doesn't get the final word. The bloodline speaks for itself. The calling doesn't need a title to be real. James had calloused knees from decades of prayer. His nephews had calloused hands from working the earth. The family of Jesus didn't lead with power or wealth or political influence. They led with faithfulness, and when the empire tried to crush them and the institution tried to erase them, they just kept showing up, kept praying, kept farming, kept telling the truth about who they were. That's the kind of legacy that outlasts empires. If this changed how you see the Bible's hidden history, subscribe. We go deep into the original Hebrew and Greek texts every week to uncover the stories that most people never hear. And the next video goes even deeper into one of the most controversial figures in early Christianity. You're going to want to see it.